good evening. Welcome. I'm Tamsin Dillon, and I'm here to present to you the Artists Roundtable as part of the curatorial practice program at SVA here in New York. And this Artists Roundtable program complements the curatorial roundtable, which is run by Stephen Madoff, where he invites esteemed curators from across the globe to share their experience and their knowledge. Here, we're going to be looking over the next few weeks at the work of an international range of important artists, inviting them to talk about the evolution of their work, their current focus, their current projects, and also how curating has played a role in their practice, whether in terms of their relationship to curators, but also in terms of how they may have been working as curators themselves and how that relates to their artistic practice. And today, thank you so much for joining us. I'm thrilled that Pedro Reyes is joining us from his studio in Mexico City. So welcome, Pedro. We're in for a treat to hear about you talking about your work, which is always a pleasure. And some of you will have seen a bio that we published about Pedro on the information. So I don't really need to say too much, other than to really just explain that Pedro, whilst he trained as an architect, he considers himself as a sculptor, but he also follows kind of seemingly kind of differing paths of aesthetic work, aesthetic research and social practice. So he works with sculpture, but also with architecture, with psychotherapy, theatre, literature, and of course, activism, in that he invites the public to take an active role as agents in many of his projects. And from this therapeutic potential of his group dynamics, he's going to talk to us through a certain number of projects that have been important to the development of his practice, which has taken him across the world, from just recently to a solo show at Museum Tinguely in Basel in 2020, a direct action project at Marta Herford Museum in Germany, of course, many projects here in America and in Latin America, but specifically Creative Time in 2016, and in 2013 with a project called PUN at the Queen's Museum, in which citizens acted as delegates, so really took action within themselves. And that work has been had a number of iterations in other places. So really just with that, I'm going to hand the floor to Pedro, and he'll speak until around about 10 to 6 New York time, at which point you will go to the questions and see what Pedro has to say in response to some of the things you've been mentioning. So, Pedro, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tamsin, so much for the introduction. And thank you everyone who has joined this evening. I will, I think that it's very interesting to be invited to talk about the curatorial aspect of artistic practice, because I want to speak first about like kind of projects that were especially complicated to organize. And also in the second half of the talk, I may show you projects where I have played a role as organizer or curator. And and this is interesting because, for instance, like I studied architecture. And as soon as I was outside of college, I opened an independent space. There was a moment of a lot of artists run spaces and inviting artists to do projects in this space was for me a sort of art education. And first, like I was in my in the 90s, I was first identified as a curator because I have done so many shows in my space to the point that I actually had to stop being a curator or stop curating shows because I had had like kind of a more mileage as a curator, and then I had to, like stop that altogether in order for people to kind of see my work as an artist. And but I had to stop curating like for 5 years or more. Uh, and now I curate again. But like it was interesting for me to experience at a young age that dilemma where like I but it was very interesting for me to like a curator will work as hard or sometimes harder than the artist on putting up a show or a project. So also, like kind of I believe that a lot of projects I have done wouldn't have been possible without the involvement of a curator. And without much ado, I may start telling about some. Let me see, how do I click here for to move two screens? Okay, well, um, this is a project called Palas por Pistolas, which consists on a campaign where people from the city of Culiacan in Mexico were invited to donate weapons. It was a gun buyback program. And those guns were melted and made into shovels to plant trees. And, uh, and that was a very complicated project to organize because I believe that it falls into this category of what we could call social sculpture. When we're talking about social sculpture, we're talking that part, I believe that sculpture could be described, one of the many definitions of sculpture could be giving shape to matter or changing the shape of matter. In this case, it was transforming these weapons, melting them down, and but also the reason why I think it's a social sculpture is because of the many actors that were involved in this process. The initiators were, like this art collection that is associated to a botanical garden in the city of Culiacan, where the patron um, of this collection, uh, when I was invited by the curator, Patrick Charpenel, to the project, I wanted to do something that would have an impact beyond the walls of the botanical garden and that could be a citywide project. So I told them about like organizing this gun buyback and to do this idea of transforming kind of guns into shovels. So we had to organize many institutions or many agents that or often are not involved in the making of art. First, we have, like this is the point, like a pictures of the guns as they were collected. We had to place a call. So we went to TV studios where we developed TV ads that were running in the TV, calling for the population to bring us a gun to the city hall, and these guns being collected and for the guns to be handled, we had to involve the army. It was very kind of like often you would say like it's very hard to kind of get the army involved in an art project, but I also believe that it made sense. The idea made sense even without you thinking of it as art. So, like we didn't have to dwell too much on what is art, but more like about like this idea that we would like be doing this transformation, no? And then I had to kind of talk to a owner of a hardware company to take the metal and melt the metal and make the shovels. So that was, like already there we have three sectors of society. One is the government, another one is private companies, both the sponsor of the garden and the sponsor of the weapon of the hardware factory, and then the civic society, both those who brought a weapon to the city hall and both those who have participated in these tree plantings. So we had to transform 1,500 guns into 1,500 shovels and plant 1,500 trees. And I think of these three components of social sectors as also as materials in this social sculpture. Because when you're doing a social sculpture, you're involving a community, and the only way to involve a community, well, it's not the only one. One way to get people involved could be through an economic incentive. No, in this case, effectively there were some gift cards that were given in exchange for guns, and these gift cards were given by this chain of stores of electric appliances. So there was like kind of a incentive at the beginning, but much more important for the tree planting, etc., is because people felt that the idea had resonated with their needs and with the sense of building a kind of a better world, and I think that was like kind of the beginning of this project. It says like I think that to do something that should work as a social sculpture have to be something that goes beyond the economic incentive, but is something that makes sense or that resonates with you and you want to fr- kind of freely and and out of solidarity or generosity to contribute with your own time. No? Um, Once done that thing, I started to be interested in repeating this action, but with a different approach. So I went to another city, Ciudad Juárez, and I work with another agency uh, where I wanted to now transform these musical instruments into, sorry, these weapons into musical instruments. So that was done through another art foundation from a collector called Moises Cosio with the help of Jessica Berlanga, who's was curator for this foundation. And what we did there was, like to take 7,000 guns and we got like kind of a container full of gun parts and we started to beat and blow and scratch and try to extract sounds of this metal. So we made a series of percussion instruments, string instruments. This is a violin, for instance, uh, wind instruments, and the transformation of a flute, sorry, of a rifle or a shotgun into a flute is this sort of idea of also social sculpture where by drilling holes in this piece of metal, you change the polarity of something that was intended to kill and now produces music. So This is so, for instance, like something that I believe that is some that I have learned of trying to make an intervention in in the real world where there's like kind of these kind of problems, like the problems of gun deaths, for instance, is that it's great to partner with organizations that have this mission. So, for instance, like this is something that I kind of joined forces with an organization called March for Our Lives, who are teens that are survivors of a school shooting that happened in Parkland, Florida, and that created a movement that became nationwide. So, for instance, with the Cincinnati chapter, we made a workshop where rifles were made into flutes, and this was performed in the March for Our Lives. So that's when I started to, like understand that museums were not necessarily the context where this work was, like the only option, like that actually sometimes making art can be, I don't know if this is the right word to work like a kind of a advertisement, to advertise a cause or a movement, but certainly to translate the needs or the mission of these groups into something tangible and also an aesthetic experience. Uh, but also at the same time to remain having a kind of a concrete effect that is not only symbolic and it's not only about creating awareness, but for instance, like for instance, like these 7,000 guns that were destroyed. Well, I want to believe that out of those 7 guns that were destroyed, at least some lives were saved because those guns are not in the streets anymore, no? So these are kind of ideas that often are not so available or sought after in the context of contemporary art. But I once had a discussion with Doris Sommer, who's a professor at Harvard University who created something called Cultural Agents Initiative. And she explained me that the humanities are under siege in a lot of universities and because like all universities want to monetize their departments, and sometimes it's hard for the humanities to prove that they are a need for society and that they make a better world. And that, and 'cause she was very interested in talking, like, well, if art can produce change, we should be able to measure change because like you cannot claim to produce change without any instruments to prove. So like at first I I was resistant to this idea of being accountable, but then I kind of started to develop this interest for accountability. And the idea is that, for instance, like when I have continued for nearly, well, like 15 years now to do these kind of gun buybacks, and try to push for this idea to become public policy, to something that is kind of a permanent program that is run. So I don't think that this is something that all art should do. I think that is very, very specific, that you demand kind of a degree of effectiveness from art. But I believe that if you want to make art accountable, you can. There's ways that you can have like this kind of aspect embedded in the work, no? Which is, like this kind of basically kind of a transformation of one thing into another, no? So for instance, like we keep measuring how many trees have been planted or how many concerts have been made and how many weapons are destroyed. So that's something that also was kind of kind of a grew out of a kind of a academic environment. So now I would like to add perhaps to this ecology of how one gives birth to projects, that sometimes you have to involve many actors, not like kind of you have the cultural institution, the private sponsor, the government, the academic institution, etc. But something that I realized also when doing this work was that there was an interpretation that, or an assumption that framed a lot of the work, which was that I was doing this work with guns because I'm from Mexico, and the assumption that Mexico is a violent place. And that wasn't really my intention, like although it's kind of a problem in Mexico, I think that is also a universal problem. Like I didn't want this work to be kind of also because when handling all these guns, I was looking at where they were coming from. And I saw that, oh, well, this was done in Austria, and this one is done in Finland, and this one is done in Belgium, and this one is done in Italy, etc. And I realized that the blame of whoever pulls the trigger, like the blame of gun deaths always falls on whoever pulls the trigger, but that the people who manufacture these weapons are off the hook, and there's no scrutiny about this the industry. So, for instance, like I made this series called Return to Sender that are like kind of like music boxes. This one is done with cannons, barrels from Glock guns. So Glock is an Austrian brand, and what I did was to kind of put a melody by Mozart, who's also Austrian, and you crank the drum and it plays a fragment from Mozart. Or this one, which has Beretta rifles. Beretta is a Italian company that is over 500 years old. So that can tell you a little bit about the resilience of these weapon manufacturers. Uh, Let me see if we can play a little video for you to see. So that's an example of, like this kind of a trying to send these weapons back to the country where they were, and kind of a telling them that what they should be exporting is music and not these weapons. No, I think that, like I want to point out that the problem that we have is that these companies obviously spend millions of dollars in lobbying to keep these weapons being sold without any background checks or legal obstacles, as they should, because not everyone should be able to buy a gun. And that's something that I have also tried to do through this workshop called Amendment to the Amendment, where people are invited to take part in the rewrite of the Second Amendment, and they're given kind of a paper where the Second Amendment is written, and they had to do a rewrite. And at the end, we pass the microphone, and everybody or every team kind of reads what's their version of how the Second Amendment should be. So also, I think of this as a social sculpture in the sense that it's like a many, many minds chiseling this piece of legislation, not like kind of a giving shape to this piece of legislation. Uh, uh, so I think that sometimes I also practice very classical sculpture. I do stone carving. Um, I just had a show of stone carvings in Lison Gallery in New York City. And a lot of my social practice or social sculpture projects oftentimes give me uh, themes, and then I do sculptures that are an allegory of this. No, this one is, for instance, like it's called also amendment, and is this idea that we should write with the pencil instead of a pen because we often do mistakes and we have to be allow ourselves to edit. So it's an allegory for me about the need to edit ourselves or to edit the laws that we gave ourselves because, like the problem that I have felt with this Second Amendment is that there's a fetish where people think that the Second Amendment was almost as if it was written by God. But the idea of that is an amendment is in itself a correction of something that was missing, and it's urgent that this Second Amendment is rewritten because, that would save thousands of lives because, there's almost sometimes more than one school shooting or mass shooting every day, no? So this is something that now changing to another theme. My experience working with disarmament of small weapons led me to work on another kind of disarmament, which is nuclear disarmament, and this was organized by a curator, Pedro Alonso, who suddenly was approached by an organization called the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, what they do since 1945 is to measure how close we are to nuclear war, to midnight. They call it like they have something called the Doomsday Clock that measures how close we are to midnight, which is the end of the world. And we are, according to them, 89 seconds to midnight, which is the closest that we have ever been. So right now, there's more risk of a nuclear war than in the height of the Cold War. And Pedro Alonso, the curator, was looking for an artist that could respond to this brief by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and he invited me because he knew my work with small weapons, and I was interested in trying to convey the threat, the nuclear threat is I was trying to find an image. So I wanted to use the mushroom cloud, but the problem with the mushroom cloud is that I didn't want it to glorify the very thing that I was wanted to critique. So that's why this inflatable sculpture, this was deployed in Times Square, as well as many other places, has this slogan called Zero Nuclear Weapons, translated into different languages. This is, for instance, at the Nahuacali Museum. Um, it has been installed, the advantages of working with inflatable sculptures is that they can travel very small and in a soft package, but then when they're blown, they can take many, like a large space, no? So this is something that that I was interested in talking about, like kind of in support of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, ICANN. I became very close with them and joined the movement as an activist, but also didn't want myself to be the only artist working on this subject, because also I know that there were a lot of artists before me that had worked in this subject through film, through music, through protest graphics, especially in the 70s and 80s. So that's when I started this project called Artists Against the Bomb. So Artists Against the Bomb, it's a poster campaign. This is, for instance, a presentation that we did at the Jelt Foundation in New York. And this is another show in Lago Algo in Mexico City. So uh, here I'm the one that is kind of working as a curator, but not entirely, because also for every artist that I invite, I ask that artist to nominate a second artist, and that second artist to nominate a third artist. So all artists have also become co-curators of the project, a sort of kind of a very rhizomatic curatorial exercise. I mean, for instance, like here I see works by Matt Mullican. That Death No Atomic Death Bomb is a Matt Mullican. Then there's this Russian sign that is done by Sam Durant. Uh, on the right, there's like a poster by Karen Holmquist. I see Julian Charrier, like different Jose Davila, different artists have done posters, and sometimes, like I'm invited to a biennial, and instead of participating as an artist, I participate as a collective, or we participate as a collective, as Artists Against the Bomb. So, for instance, this is in the Malta Biennale. And basically, the project now is kind of a nearly 300 artists. Uh, Here, for instance, you see there's a poster at the left by Thomas Hirschhorn, and in the middle by Isamu Noguchi, and on the right by Tanya Tolokonikova from Pussy Riot. This is on the stairs of the Met Museum, and this is all kind of posters. Like the idea of here with this kind of a art project is that oftentimes the anti-nuclear organizations have very little budget, and I wanted to create like a kind of a art project where the artists. Let me show you. Maybe I can jump to another presentation where I can show you a little bit about this. Oh, yeah. Okay. Let me see if I can then make this bigger. But this is, for instance, like the Noguchi poster. Um, this is by uh, Magdalena Bakanovitz. This is a poster by the Guerrilla Girls. And what we do is that the use of these sculptures and these posters is a way to kind of also create like a education program, etc. Uh, and different installations where, for instance, like these are some of the shows where we have, or some of the venues where we have presented it, but all the time the posters are printed locally. So you don't have to spend on shipping or um or um, or insurance. And also uh, the artists give us permission to do merchandise, uh, um, me see. I don't see if we have this pop-up store, but we have sometimes do these um uh, merch like T-shirts, etc., just for the art to circulate on different platforms. And also, I found out that it's good to have just like kind of this experiment that they can sometimes be billboards, sometimes can be postcards, sometimes can be digital billboards, sometimes it can be social media posts. So, like we tried for these graphic arts to kind of exist on different mediums. And the artists that we invite give us the permission to do so. So that's a little bit like kind of an idea of doing an agitprop, no, like this kind of a role that protest graphic have. Um, Again, for instance, like this sometimes is kind of gives me themes for doing some of my stone carvings. This, for instance, is called the treaty, which is like a carving, or this other piece, which is called la himsa. That is, well, actually, like this is an edition that I made to fundraise for the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, which is, like this kind of a bronze dove that is on a pillar, but also looks like a kind of a arm uh, trying to stop the bomb from falling. No, it's a kind of a allegory of another, trying to search for another symbol. So I as a sculptor, for me, the challenge was how do I make a sculpture that is at the same time a dove and a hand, with obviously nods to the vocabulary of modern sculpture. And then I make some other sculptures related to this theme. For instance, like this is a bird cage, which is in the same shape and size of the little boy, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. And it's because, like it's also a critique of the idea that Hiroshima was necessary to end the Second World War, which is a myth, it's a lie. Japan had already surrendered before the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But it was not clear to whom they had surrendered. So it was like either and also it's not entirely true that the United States won Second World War. It was really there were two superpowers that kind of became triumphant. One was Russia also. So there was like this kind of risk of Russia taking over Japan, and the United States had been kind of fighting these uh, proxy wars with Russia in in Korea, for instance. So that's why they decided to drop these bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, just to make clear that the Japanese should surrender to them. So that's the when the occupation of Japan started, no? Um, this is a film that is called Under the Cloud that I made with the downwinders, who are uh, communities affected by nuclear tests. This was a documentary that I filmed in New Mexico. It was out of a commission from Site Santa Fe, where Brandy Caoba, the curator, invited me. I told her that I wanted to do a short film, a documentary with the people that, and a lot of them are indigenous peoples that, because these tests, starting with the Trinity test in 1945 to the more than 2,000 tests that have been conducted in different parts of the world, a lot of the times these tests had been done on indigenous lands. There's this kind of a concept of nuclear colonialism. That is, that for instance, for instance, the United States was testing these on Navajo lands and in Nevada, in New Mexico, in Arizona, but also on the Marshall Islands or the Bikini Atoll, where they destroyed entire islands. And since then, populations have to be evacuated and have never and will never be able to return to their homeland because these places are now radioactive hells and will be for several thousand years. The French did this test in Algeria, the British in Australia, the Russians in Kazakhstan, and you know like and these tests were banned in 1991. So that's why kind of we forgot about nuclear war because there's not been nuclear detonations since 1991, and that's something that kind of made us believe that the Cold War was over. But also, what has happened since is that all those nukes that were done in the 80s are now kind of obsolete because of the technology. You know, like the launching codes were on floppy disk and things like that. So now there's been a big push for renewing the entire nuclear arsenals. The United States alone is spending $2 trillion on new nuclear weapons. Uh, and the same is happening in China and Russia, etc. You know, there's 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, but because there's no activism, no resistance from society, and it's an invisible threat, people kind of just don't mind, and kind of people are not aware of this issue. But we are closer than ever because of several reasons. These new nuclear weapons are, you know, sometimes as small as a coffee mug, and you can blow, you know, like a small city with them. They can be deployed by drones or by mail even, and they can be controlled by AI. So the temptation to use them is very high, especially on the hands of a lot of the, you know, not the like kind of the leaders of these countries, including the Trump. It's not. There are people who, you know, at some point can be not sane in their mind, no? So in the middle of the pandemic, I suddenly found out that there is this Writers Museum in Mexico City, and I have never heard of this place. So I call and I say, "Hey, are you open? I want to visit." And they tell me, "No, the Writers Museum was founded like by a writer who died 3 years ago, and since his death, we're not open anymore." And I asked the boys, "Who are you?" And she told me, "I'm Rosario Casco, the widow." And I invited her to have lunch the next day, and I to learn more about this project. And then she told me that the Writers Museum had been all these collections of writers, typewriters, and eh, first editions, letters, manuscripts, etc. So what I did was to formalize a donation of all these contents. She didn't want it to keep that project alive and didn't have the resources to do so. So I adopted all these, and then what I started to do is to invite other contemporary writers to give me stuff like notebooks, personal objects, drawings, letters, manuscripts, and everything is organized in vitrines. I wrote a book because when you have a show of documents, there's this anxiety that you're not gonna be able to read everything that is in the vitrines. So I thought that the best way for the exhibition to exist was actually in a book form, where I selected fragments from all the kind of stories, anecdotes, and letters, and that we have, and uh, and then uh, and then I started to do this kind of labels for all the objects. This is, for instance, the founder of the museum, René Vilés Favila. This is so among the strange objects that we have is his urn with his ashes, but also, for instance, like his card, because he was a communist and he was a card carrying communist. So there's his communist card. But for instance, like another thing I wrote to another poet that I know, Christian Bock, who had this book translated into a DNA strip that lives in this bacteria, and he sent me this kind of uh, 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 I don't know what you call it, like this kind of a piece of glass that has there's a term, but I forgot it in English.
In
Uh,
the slide that you
yeah,
look
like
at,
a glass slide. Yeah.
microscope.
This is, for instance, like the best of Rubén Bonifaz Nuño. This is, for instance, like a book dedicated to Luis Buñuel by André Breton. Um, this is, for instance, like Dom Sylvester Howard, who is also on the limits of what literature is, more kind of a concrete poetry. This is a feminist writer, Gabriela Jauregui, who decided to show pink panties. Uh, this is the first science fiction magazine edited by Alexander Jodorowsky, a bust I made of Clarice Lispector, a head that I made of Nawi Olin. And this is something that, like that also I do because, like sometimes I like doing portraits. And portraits in sculpture are uh, difficult. They don't exist well in the world because sometimes there's no context. No, like for instance, like it's very rare that someone will want to buy a portrait that is not someone they have a very personal connection with. So I do these heads that are portraits because, like I think that figurative sculpture is at least 100 times harder than abstract sculpture. Is like extremely difficult. So it's a challenge to try to kind of do a portrait that does justice. And but also I know that there's often no opportunities to do this. So the Writers Museum has been an opportunity for me to show some of these portraits that I like doing within a context that kind of really play where they have a function also that is to kind of play homage to these writers. So this is, for instance, like now I have this show that is this museum, which like can exist with or without my work. Like the work that I have included in it is more like a kind of a to give it like also like this dynamism. But I also like now I have to keep this exhibition touring, and eventually I hope it should find a permanent home. Um, but like this is the kind of thing about like adopting archives that they take up a lot of space. They need organizing. They need like all this kind of register work, and so that's I'm gonna stop here. So
Yeah, it's
we.
amazing, very expansive project. Again,
Mhm.
like all of your projects, incredibly expansive, but it's so it's not permanently there. It's quite new, this exhibition. It literally just opened last month, I think.
Yeah, yes. September was an insane month because I opened 4 shows in one single month. Uh,
Wow.
eh,
There,
so
there was one here in New York. There was that one. Where are the others?
for instance, like I did one in Carleton College, which is a college in
Oh, yes.
Minnesota, and another one is the Medellin Biennale in
Oh,
Colombia.
yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Hmm.
Well, caught you a good time to kind of talk through some of these things. And the it's interesting the story behind how these different projects get started, and the what you were saying about how the Writers Museum came about because you noticed it, you hadn't seen it before, you approached them. Is that and you talked earlier about a project where you were invited to start this anti-nuclear sort of project.
Yes.
I mean, every one of your projects or your artworks obviously follow some kind of trajectory or have it, focused on your own interest, but how often is it prompted through a curatorial kind of question or
Um, um, Often it's a kind of a like kind of a it's a meeting of the two,
yeah,
because for instance, like something that I think is something that I didn't had such a clear idea. It just turned out to be this way, but like I have a very wide range of interests.
yeah,
And in that sense, for instance, like there's this truism by Jenny Holzer she says monomania is a prerequisite for success, but I have found that the opposite is also true in the sense that, for instance, that I have like these different, I call them planets. So I have like kind of 7 different planets. And one planet is, for instance, the nuclear weapons. Another one is the books. Another one
yeah,
is the stone. Another one is architecture. I didn't show all the planets. I just showed 3
yeah,
in this lecture. But like that, I'm invited to certain contexts because someone finds this. There's another planet where I'm a puppeteer and I do puppets.
yes,
I haven't done that in a few years. I miss it. But
yeah,
just like now I'm participating in a show at CCA in San Francisco that is showing those videos. And those show videos had not been shown in 4 years, no? So sometimes there's like these different areas of interest, and then for me it has been a good thing to kind of to be able to respond to different calls from different that come from
yeah.
different themes.
So, well, I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation in our seminar, which follows this. But just before we go, we did get one question
Yes.
that relates back to the Pallas por Pistolas project, which I'm really glad that you talked about in a really detailed way. And Jenna Sabom says, did you really send the music boxes back to the gun companies, which you mentioned? Did you charge or bill them for the music box, or did you gift these?
Well, no, what I meant was sending back to the country, like not the factory. But for instance, like
Okay.
when this show was done in Switzerland, at the Tinguely Museum, it was curious that that I use there, for instance, like rifles from a brand called Carabina. What
Yeah.
was hard, believe it or not, what was hard was to find one Swiss composer. It happens that, like that Switzerland, in all of its history, has not produced any, like, not one single famous musician. There's in the end, I use one called Mani Matter that seems to be very famous in Switzerland, but only Swiss people know about him. But like
Oh, I find
there's
that
rich
really hard to
countries that seem to be very rich, but they are poor in other areas.
do. Not good in music.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
Well, on that strange note, if you'll pardon the pun, um, I think we'll draw this to a close on the dot at 6 p.m. And thank you everybody for joining us. And um, it's been a fascinating talk and presentation by Pedro Reyes. And thank you very much, Pedro. We'll see you with the students in the seminar in just a second.
Okay. Do I keep stay on this link?
No,
Ah,
it's the other link that we sent
all
you.
right, all right. Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Super. See you. Okay.
Um,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Pedro. Bye for now.